All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Old Testament. In our last recording, we wrapped up the book of Exodus formally and officially. And in this session, what I want to do is a special study on the topic of slavery, not only in Exodus, but in Leviticus and Deuteronomy as well, in the whole Pentateuch. And I'm going to attach it to the Exodus series, but we will be able to reference back to it when we get to passages about slavery in Leviticus or when we get to passages about slavery in Deuteronomy. And the reason we need to do this is because this is just a real subject that has caused some people some difficulty. It creates some confusion for us when we read these passages, particularly from our vantage point and in our cultural time and place. And so we need to think clearly about what is Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy actually saying about slavery and try to hear it the way the original texts were intended to be heard. So let me just read you a few passages both from Exodus and Leviticus, so we can hear some of what the text actually says. And then we'll go back through and try to just give some of a framework for understanding what these passages about slavery in the Torah or the Pentateuch are actually about. All right. So let me read a couple passages. First of all, from Exodus 21, we looked at these passages in a little bit of detail when we walked through this section of Exodus. And so you can always reference back to the recording on Exodus 21 in the Exodus commentary series. But here's what it says. Exodus 21, picking up in verse 2, "If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you for 6 years. But on the 7th year, he shall go out as a free man without any further payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he's the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, while he's in slavery is the idea, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he will go out alone." I explained that line in particular in some detail in the Exodus 21 recording, so you might want to check that out. But if the slave plainly says, "I love my master, I love my wife, I love my children, I don't want to go out as a free man," then his master shall bring him to God, and then he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve his master permanently. If a man, jumping down a little bit in Exodus 21, this is Exodus 21, verse 7, "If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. If he doesn't have the authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these 3 things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money." So those are a couple passages related to this topic of slavery from Exodus. Let me read another one from Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25, verse 44 says, "As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. You may also acquire them from the sons of foreign residents who reside among you, and from their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land. They also may become your possession. You may also pass them on as an inheritance to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, but in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another." So there you have it. There's a couple passages about slavery, and you can see why it's like, man, what in the world is going on here? And these passages can be confusing and troubling and difficult for us to understand. So our goal in this recording is to prevent misunderstanding of what the text is actually saying and promote a more full and accurate understanding to the best of our ability. And the reason for that is because slavery is a persistent human evil. It has been a human evil for as far back as recorded history, and still ongoing in modern times in various fashions and forms. It's a persistent human evil. And we need to have a more full understanding of these passages because it's too easy and too common for people to read what passages like these say and do so through the lens of our own modern experience. And all of that leads to, I think, an easy, cavalier misunderstanding of what these Exodus and Leviticus passages are actually saying. So, to begin thinking this through, let me just state up front what I feel like or consider is a fundamental principle for reading what the Torah says in a lot of its laws, in this case specifically about slavery itself. Here is the fundamental principle. God in the Torah is regulating, not commanding, regulating what already exists in their fallen world, and he's doing so in a way to provide protections for the vulnerable. That's really important. So God is regulating what already exists in their fallen world, and he's providing protections for the vulnerable. What that means is God is regulating a less than ideal situation. These laws about slavery don't express the ideal. The ideal comes in biblical passages looking to the restoration of all things. They're regulating a less than ideal situation. And God's laws on this topic of servanthood and slavery actually provided human dignity and radical protections, unlike anything else found in some of the law codes that we have from the ancient Near East. So, if we will attempt to step into their world in good faith, just like traveling to a foreign country today, right? And you don't want to be a cultural snob. You want to try to understand this culture and its differences and the way they do things and why they do things the way they do them, right? We want to step into that in good faith with a good heart, try to understand their world. If we'll do that with regard to these laws in the Torah about slavery, step into their world as best as we can, and read the relevant passages from the perspective of the principle that I just gave about regulating what exists in their fallen world, providing protections for the vulnerable. If we'll do that, then we'll be able to hear what God is saying much more clearly and accurately. If, however, on the other hand, we approach the text with suspicion and with chronological snobbery, think we're better and smarter and know more, and we do all of that, we'll actually miss what's being said. So, with all of that stated up front, here are a handful of important considerations to keep in mind when you read passages about slavery in the Old Testament law, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And the first has to do with that very word, slavery itself. It's really an unfortunate translation. The Hebrew word is ebed, and the meaning of that word is not what we picture when we hear the word slavery. So I really wish the translators would use a more proper word that doesn't communicate everything in our own cultural experience. This Hebrew word, ebed, has a spectrum of meanings, a range of meanings from everything like what we would call an employee down to what we would call a servant, even a fairly poor and lowly servant. That's the range. It actually rarely, if ever, refers to the idea of a slave like those in the South during the early days of the United States, right? Like that whole American slave trade and that stuff. This word ebed almost never refers to that sort of thing. In fact, here's two statements from two different Hebrew scholars that say this. One, John Goldengay puts it this way: there's nothing inherently lowly or undignified about being an ebed. The word doesn't inherently apply that you're a lowly, undignified, slave like we think of when we hear that word. The word just didn't mean that. Just like being an employee. There's nothing inherently lowly or undignified about being an employee for a company, right? Or Matyer, it says Hebrew has no vocabulary for slavery in our sense, only servanthood. And so this word, ebed, just doesn't mean what you think it means when they translate it slavery. And that's why I say it's an unfortunate translation. Ebed, the idea of being an ebed wasn't lowly. It wasn't racial at all. It was widespread and affected all different kinds of people in the ancient world. It often came about simply due to poverty or debt. Very often, the word referred to a situation more like what we would call an indentured servant. In fact, when you think about the United States of America, roughly 1/2 to 2/3 of the early white colonists in the 13 colonies that became the United States of America, roughly 1/2 to 2/3 came as indentured servants and worked off their debt once they arrived here in America. Well, that's often the case with the servants in the Bible during the days of the Old Testament law. And the language actually of selling himself or being acquired or being your possession, actually, that language refers to what we would call a contractual agreement to work off debt. It doesn't mean that they were your possession. That's just not what the language or the word actually meant in their cultural context. You can hear sort of a rough analogy to that even today with some sports stars. Think of like a soccer star, or if you're outside the United States, a football star, right? When we're talking about soccer or football, a football player who was sold to such and such club. They were sold to Manchester United or Bayern Munich or whatever it is, right? Like they were sold to them. It doesn't mean they're a slave or they're their property per se. It means they've now been traded and they're under contract with that new club. Well, this is the same idea when the Old Testament law talks about selling himself. In other words, I'm your indentured servant and we're under contract to work off the debt. So that's the first thing. This word ebed doesn't mean slavery like we think it means slavery. It's an unfortunate translation. It's more the idea of an employee down to an indentured servant or to a permanent servant who has, for various reasons, become a permanent servant in a household. Second consideration is this. The form of these laws, as we noted in the intro, shows that they're regulating existing situations, not commanding ideal situations. They're regulating what already exists in their cultural context, trying to put some provisions and protections on it. The form of these laws is what is called case law. We talked about this when we went through some of these various laws in Exodus 21 through 23. Case laws go like this. If this is the case, then you will do this. We're not mandating anything by that. We're simply saying if such and such happens or such and such is the case, here's what I want you to do. It's case law. And what we're dealing with are real economic conditions, real economic realities in the ancient world that had to be addressed somehow. How do we address them? And the laws of the Torah are unlike anything else found in the ancient Near East in that they provide rights and dignities to those affected by these realities, which then leads to the third consideration. So second one is these are case laws regulating existing situations. The third consideration is then that the law, the Torah, provides rights and protections for ebeds, for servants, that was completely countercultural. For example, right at the beginning, Exodus chapter 20, in the 10 Commandments, where we get the Sabbath command, Exodus 20, verse 10, guess who's included on they get a day off and they get rest? Servants are. Slaves, ebeds. They are also included in you're going to give your animals rest and you're going to give your servants rest. You're all taking a rest. They get a day off. That's unheard of in the ancient Near East. And not only that, the instructions that we actually read up above from Exodus is every 7 years, the servants their debt gets forgiven and they're free to go. So their contract to work off their debt can be no more than 6 years, because in the 7th year they're gone. So max contract is a 6-year contract to work off their debt, and then they're free to go. Again, this is radically generous. They don't even have to pay off the rest of their debt. If they've worked for 6 years and they still haven't worked off their debt fully, God's like, that's it. We're done. It's good enough. And radically generous, like way more generous than creditors practice today. Where you're paying. I mean, I'm paying on my hip replacement surgery, still into it, and I have 3 more years to go. I'll be at that 6-year mark when I get my 6 years from hip replacement surgery, when I get my debt paid off. If it had gone longer, guess what? The law would have said, you're free to go. You're done. No more paying off that debt. That's radically generous. And so the law actually is very countercultural in what it says for servants. Deuteronomy chapter 23, 15 and 16. If there is a servant who is being mistreated by his master, his boss, and he is being treated contrary to the law, contrary to the way he's supposed to be treated, guess what? He has the right to flee to another city and seek asylum. And that city doesn't have to hand him back over to who's mistreating him. Again, that is radical and providing protection for the servant who's being mistreated. Exodus chapter 21 says this, verses 26 and 27. Listen to again these protections. If someone strikes the eye of his male or female ebed, servant, and destroys it, ruins his eye. Again, this is a case law. Notice, if this happens, here's what you shall do. You will let the slave go free on account of the eye. You don't have the right to smack your servant across the face, ruin his eye. If you do that, he gets to go free. Or if he knocks out a tooth of his male and female servant, guess what? Servant gets to go free. He doesn't get to punch his servant, knock out his teeth, and keep his servant. That's inappropriate. Servants in ancient Israel had far more legal rights and protections than anywhere else in the ancient Near East. In fact, one scholar says that the laws of the Torah are actually designed to make Israel uncomfortable with the entire practice and regulate the power of the master who is in charge of managing these servants. And that then leads into consideration number 4. So the first one is that the word ebed doesn't mean slavery like we think it means. The second one is that these laws are regulating existing conditions, real realities that needed to be managed somehow. The third consideration is that it provided rights and protections for servants. And number 4, closely related to that third one, is that servants were treated with dignity as human beings. And when you hear some of these protections, like we just described under point 3 up above, there's an agency and a dignity to servants in what the Old Testament law, or the Torah, says that is, again, countercultural. In fact, scholars point out that it's the first time in all of world literature where slaves and servants were treated as human beings and offered these kind of rights and protections. And that continues clear out through the Old Testament into the New Testament, where there's agency and protections and dignities. William Morrow, one scholar, puts it like this. He says, the biblical slavery laws were calculated to make readers uneasy about the ethics of owning servants. These laws represent an early strategy for raising readers' conscience about the institution of servanthood and slavery, implicitly calling it into question. Overall, their tactics reflect an ethic of concern for the vulnerable, because they were treated as image bearers with dignity. So that's number 4, that the law provided dignity to servants as human beings. And again, that's countercultural. The 5th consideration is, and this is really important, so pay close attention, the type of slavery that we typically think of, like the type of slavery from the Atlantic slave trade, or that was common in the early United States of America. That type of slavery, that was actually forbidden in Israel. Listen to what it says in Exodus 21, verse 16. He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. And the idea of the word kidnap there is this idea of man stealing. It was the idea of what we would call human trafficking today, where you take somebody to traffic them. And notice what the punishment is for that. You do that, then the death penalty is what's appropriate for you. It's completely outlawed. This idea of human trafficking, slave trade, and all of that outlawed in ancient Israel. We already read the passage in Exodus 21 where if this person who is the boss, maybe it's even the supervisor of the servants working in the field or working in the household, if power goes to his head and he beats another servant or another slave, then guess what happens? The slave gets to go free. Exodus 21, 26 through 27. We read that. So the type of slavery that we think of is outlawed by the Torah in ancient Israel. And so, number 6, again, what we see in these laws is not the ideal, but it is realistic for the fallen world. We have to read it that way. This is just realistic for the fallen world of their time and our time. There are economic realities, there are employment realities, there are human realities that need some sort of management. That's what these laws provide. Now, obviously, they're not the ideal. In fact, the Old Testament goal, the Torah's goal itself, was no debt servitude. That was its goal. That's why you get, for example, in Deuteronomy 15, you get gleaning laws. When you harvest your field, don't harvest it all. Leave the stuff that falls on the ground for the poor to come and gather for themselves. That's why we get the rights of setting servants free, because the goal in a more ideal state would be, let's create a society where there is leftover grain that the poorer among you can come and gather up themselves, where there's leftover olives from the olive harvest where they can come and gather themselves, where there's leftover grapes from the grape harvest where they can come and gather themselves. Let's make sure that their debt servitude goes no longer than 6 years. And in an ideal world, there would be none of that. And so the law recognizes that it had inherited a less than ideal situation just because of the fact that we live outside of Eden. We live in a fallen world where things aren't the way they're supposed to be. And the law recognizes that, and it's seeking to regulate it. And it does so in radically countercultural ways to protect the most vulnerable. I think we just need to recognize that that's the way the Bible handles some of these realities, these economic realities and practical realities of life. In some cases, it would be actually better for the person to remain as a permanent servant. You heard that. If they decide they want to do that, they love their master, they want to stay, he can pierce their ear with an awl as the mark that they're a permanent servant. And they're going to stay there. Why? Because it's a better situation for them than being poor and not having a place to work, not having the protections and the household and the resources of the household and protections of the household that they're a part of. And so sometimes just being a permanent servant in a large household actually provides more economic resources, more protections than they would get outside. Why not stay there if your master is good? That's the picture. That's the idea. And so to wrap this up, let's just restate our key principle. God is regulating, not commanding, what already exists in their fallen world and providing protections for the vulnerable. Read these texts that way. Do some historical work if you need to. Step into their cultural context and try to imagine what would it be like to live in this world and in their situation. When I think of this, though the situation obviously isn't exactly the same, it's not a one-to-one comparison, I picture my time in Haiti working at a mission complex where there was about 120 orphans on the compound and I was leading a pastor's conference. And there was a gal who obviously was poor. I don't know her whole story. She probably was somewhere in her 30s. She was single. And what I could gather was she had a rather rough background, and she worked on the mission complex. She swept floors, did dishes, and tidied up bathrooms and all that sort of stuff. Had a very tender spirit. When I was leaving my time there, um, this was really, it was not like I spent a whole lot of time around her, but I went and told her goodbye. And um, she gave me a little kiss on the cheek and said thank you and gave me a blessing as I was getting ready to leave. And I picture that woman because here's a woman who she has nothing. Um, and if she didn't live on the compound and she didn't help do work around the compound, she would be in a desperate situation in the mountains of Haiti. She would have no protection. She would struggle to find food. She would be vulnerable to being taken advantage of by all sorts of wicked and evil people. Working as she did, almost like a servant at the mission complex, gave her protection and resources she would never have otherwise. And a lot of what these laws of the Torah did was to provide protections and resources for people just like that. And so, if we can step into that world and try to understand what these laws are attempting to regulate, it will help us read those laws with a little bit more of good faith, be a little bit more fair to trying to hear them accurately than just immediately condemning the Bible for condoning slavery, as some people are wont to do. That's not at all what it's actually doing. So I hope that helps as you read through some of these sections in the Torah that are confusing, a bit challenging, that we don't fully understand. Hope it provides some guidance for reading those sections well. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the Old Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that is only possible because of the generosity, literally, of dozens and dozens and dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, the easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com. There will be a give button. It'll redirect you to a page, my page at World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit that provides some financial help and accountability for this ministry and other independent ministries. You can set up a one-time donation there, or if you want to make it a recurring monthly donation, there's a little box that says make this monthly, and all those funds will come this way. Thanks a ton for your support.